The wind howled through the narrow streets of Khem-Aaru, carrying whispers of something unseen. Elder Zahur sat before his modest hut, his aged hands trembling as he clutched his staff. His eyes, clouded by years of wisdom, stared beyond the village walls into the darkening horizon. "The darkness will come," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It will swallow this land, and none shall remain." A group of villagers gathered nearby, listening with uneasy amusement. They had heard Zahur's warnings before, tales of curses, omens, and ancient wrath. Yet, life in Khem-Aaru had remained unchanged for generations. "Elder Zahur sees doom in every shadow," one man chuckled, shaking his head. But the signs were there. Birds had fled the village days ago, their song silenced. The cattle refused to eat, their wide eyes filled with dread. Even the river seemed restless, its waters churning against the banks as if seeking escape. That night, Zahur dreamt of an eclipse darker than night itself. He saw his people screaming, their bodies dissolving into nothingness. He awoke with a start, heart pounding. He had to warn them again before it was too late. A weary traveler arrived at the village gates at dawn, his robes dusty from the long journey. He spoke of an eclipse foretold in the royal city, an event unseen in generations. "The sun will vanish at midday," he said. "The sky will turn black, and Ra's eye will close for a time." The villagers murmured, shifting uneasily. An eclipse was unheard of in their lifetimes. They knew the gods ruled the heavens, guiding the sun and stars. What did it mean for the sun to vanish? That evening, an eerie silence gripped the village. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Children huddled close to their mothers, sensing the unease in the air. Far above, the first sliver of darkness crept across the sun. The sky was already changing. Beneath the temple's shadow, a hooded figure lit a torch, its flame casting flickering shapes against the stone walls. A small group of villagers gathered in secret, their faces tense with anticipation. "The gods have sent a sign," the hooded one whispered. "The time has come to speak with our ancestors." They had waited for this, the return of lost spirits, a chance to unlock forbidden knowledge. The eclipse, they believed, was a doorway. If they performed the ritual, they could reach beyond the veil. Elder Zahur, sensing the disturbance, made his way toward the temple, his heart heavy with dread. He had seen such rituals before, always ending in disaster. "Do not call to the darkness," he pleaded, his voice hoarse. "Some doors are meant to remain closed." But the chant had already begun. The flames burned higher, and in the sky, the sun continued to disappear. Khem-Aaru stood, as it always had, a quiet village nestled near the banks of the Nile, where golden fields swayed in the breeze, and the scent of fresh bread lingered in the air. The people of Khem-Aaru lived simple lives, content with their crops, their prayers, and the gentle rhythm of the river that had nourished them for generations. Farmers rose with the sun, their hands calloused from years of toil. Fishermen cast their nets into the flowing waters, whispering thanks to Hapi, god of the Nile, for his endless bounty. Children ran barefoot through the dusty streets, their laughter echoing against the mud brick houses. In the village square, merchants called out their wares: clay pots, woven baskets, and spices carried from far-off lands. The temple stood tall at the heart of it all, its ancient pillars inscribed with hymns to Ra, the great sun god. Elder Zahur sat near the temple steps, watching the life around him with weary eyes. He had seen this village grow, seen its people flourish, and yet something in the air had shifted. The birds no longer sang in the mornings. The river was restless, and the sky seemed to hold a secret it refused to share. Even in the warmth of the afternoon sun, Zahur shivered. Something was coming. It was just past sunset when the woman arrived. Wrapped in dark robes that billowed like smoke, she stood at the village gates, her face hidden beneath a hood. She did not ask for food, nor did she seek shelter. Instead, she spoke a single warning. The eye will close, and the void will awaken. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Travelers were common, but this woman carried an air of something unnatural, something ancient. They hesitated, unsure whether to send her away or call for the priests. Word of the stranger spread quickly. The villagers gathered, whispering among themselves. Some clutched their amulets, muttering prayers for protection. Others dismissed her as a madwoman. When the high priest arrived, he was unimpressed. "There is no void here, only Khem-Aaru and the gods who protect it." The woman lifted her head just enough for Zahur to glimpse her eyes, dark, endless, like the night sky before a storm. "You do not understand," she murmured. "But you will." And with that, she turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness beyond the village. Zahur's grip tightened around his staff. He had seen many things in his lifetime, but never had he felt dread like this. By morning, the sky had changed. It was subtle at first, a heaviness in the air, a dimming of the sunlight, as though a veil had been drawn over the heavens. The Nile, usually calm, surged against its banks, its waters rising higher than they should. Farmers waded into their flooded fields, shaking their heads in confusion. The river had never behaved this way before, not without warning. Near the temple, the priests gathered around the obelisk of Ra, sacred monument that had stood for centuries. But something was wrong. A long, jagged crack had formed down its center. "The gods are testing us," the high priest declared. "We must remain faithful." But the people were not convinced. The omens were growing. The birds had left. The animals were uneasy. And now, the obelisk, the very symbol of the sun god's power, was broken. Zahur watched the faces of his people, saw the uncertainty in their eyes. They did not want to believe. But belief would not change the truth. The world was shifting, and something was coming through. Zahur wasted no time. He went to the village chief, his voice urgent. "You must listen," he pleaded. "These signs, they are warnings. The sky is changing. The river is restless. The obelisk has cracked. We must prepare." But the chief, a man of logic and reason, shook his head. "Elder, you have lived long, and you have seen many things. But there is no curse here. The gods do not abandon their people." Zahur turned to the high priest. "You, of all people, must see what is happening. The gods are speaking to us." The priest sighed. "We have seen eclipses before, Zahur. The sun always returns. But this is not an ordinary eclipse," Zahur whispered. The priest looked away. The chief dismissed him with a wave of his hand, and the villagers, those who still clung to hope, returned to their daily routines, trying to pretend that nothing was wrong. But not all of them. That night, a handful of families quietly packed their belongings. Without a word, they slipped into the darkness, leaving behind the village that had been their home. They did not know where they were going. They only knew they had to leave. The morning of the eclipse arrived with an unnatural stillness. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The villagers awoke to a sky draped in an eerie, grayish hue. Zahur stood outside his hut, his heart heavy. He scanned the faces of his people, some still laughing, some whispering nervously, others pretending nothing was wrong. But the truth was undeniable now. The gods had sent warnings, and they had gone unheeded. By midday, the first shadow crept across the sun. A hush fell over the village as people gathered in the square, watching in awe. The golden disk of Ra, the ever-present guardian of the skies, was being devoured by darkness. Children clung to their mothers. Men shifted uneasily. Even the high priest, who had dismissed Zahur's warnings, now furrowed his brow in concern. And then the wind came, a sharp, sudden gust, carrying a whisper of voice, though no one spoke. It slithered through the streets, curling into homes, wrapping around throats like unseen fingers. Zahur clutched his staff. The darkness was deepening, and with it something else was stirring. Beneath the temple, hidden away in a cavern of forgotten stone, the sect gathered. Their faces were shrouded beneath heavy hoods, their voices a murmur of ancient incantations. At the center of the chamber, a large blackened bowl held smoldering embers, thick smoke curling into the air. "The time has come," the leader whispered, lifting a blade above his head. "The gods have opened the gate." A young acolyte stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held a clay tablet covered in unreadable script. "Are we certain this is wise?" he asked. The leader turned his head slowly, the fire casting jagged shadows across his face. "Do not fear wisdom, fear ignorance. The old ways have been hidden for too long. Tonight we restore them." Above them, the temple walls trembled. The flickering torchlight swayed, as if recoiling from something unseen. And outside, as the villagers gazed at the dying sun, Zahur felt it. A shift in the air. A disturbance in the balance of Ma'at. Someone had opened a door that should have remained closed. The moment the eclipse reached totality, the sky changed. What had been a deepening darkness became something else entirely, an emptiness beyond black, a void without stars, without light. It was not simply the absence of the sun, but the absence of existence itself. Then came the sound. A wail erupted from above, a sound no human throat could produce. It was neither a voice nor a cry, but something older, something raw and primal. It clawed through the air, rattling bones, seeping into the very fabric of the village. People clutched their ears, collapsing to their knees. The children screamed. The animals fled. Zahur stumbled backward, his breath stolen by the sheer wrongness of it all. The villagers turned to the high priest, their eyes wide with terror. "What is happening?" they cried. "What have we done?" But the priest had no answer. He, too, had fallen to his knees, hands trembling in prayer to a god who no longer seemed to be listening. And then, in the distance, the first building began to dissolve. The temple's great pillar, centuries old, carved with the names of forgotten kings, began to crack. A sound like thunder rumbled through the village as the stone crumbled, disintegrating into dust before it even hit the ground. The people ran. They did not know where to go, only that they had to move. But there was no safety. The houses along the riverbank flickered, their walls shifting between solid and shadow. The marketplace, once alive with voices and trade, was emptying, tables, baskets, and wares simply vanishing into the air, as though they had never existed. Zahur grabbed a young boy who had fallen in the chaos, hoisting him onto his feet. "Run!" he shouted. "To the river, now!" But the river itself had changed. The waters churned violently, then froze as if turned to glass. A woman rushed toward it, but the moment her foot touched the surface, she was gone, erased from existence without so much as a scream. Zahur turned back. There was no saving Khem-Aaru. Only those who could flee had a chance. The survivors ran. The dust of their disappearing homes clung to their skin, their lungs burning from the effort. Behind them, the village continued to unravel, streets twisting, walls melting into nothing. A voice rang through the chaos, clear despite the screams. "Follow me." Zahur turned. The nomadic woman, the one who had warned them, stood at the edge of the village, her dark robes whipping in the wind. Her eyes, still unreadable, locked onto his. "There is no time," she said. "Come or be forgotten." He did not hesitate. He gathered the frightened survivors, pushing them forward. "Go," he urged. "Do not look back." They ran, past the broken temple, past the fading marketplace, past the village walls that no longer stood. The wailing from the sky deepened, a sound of sorrow, of loss. Thensilence. Zahur turned, chest heaving. Khem-Aaru was gone. Only empty desert remained. Zahur stood frozen at the edge of the desert, his breath ragged. Just moments ago, Khem-Aaru had stood behind him, a village full of life, of voices, of memories. Now there was nothing. The land where the village had once thrived was blank, smooth as untouched sand. No ruins, no debris, no signs that life had ever existed there. It was as if Khem-Aaru had been plucked from the world, erased from time itself. The surviving villagers collapsed to their knees, staring in shock. Tears streamed down the faces of those who had lost their homes, their families, their entire world in an instant. Then, a whisper drifted through the air, not a voice, but an echo, a memory of what had been. It carried the last remnants of Khem-Aaru's existence, vanishing with the wind. Zahur swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his staff. This was no natural disaster, no punishment from the gods. This was something else, something ancient. The nomadic woman stepped beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the void where the village had been. "It has begun," she murmured. Zahur turned to her, his voice hoarse. "What have we witnessed?" She exhaled slowly. The breaking of a seal, a fate long foretold. The survivors did not yet understand, but soon they would. The nomadic woman knelt, scooping up a handful of sand from where the village once stood. She let it slip between her fingers, watching as the grains faded before they touched the ground. "This place is no longer part of this world," she said. Zahur frowned. "What does that mean?" She turned her gaze to him. Khem-Aaru was built on forbidden ground, a place where the balance of Ma'at had been broken long before your time. The gods permitted its existence so long as no one disturbed what lay beneath. Zahur's breath hitched. "The sect." She nodded. "They did not summon gods. They did not call upon ancestors. They opened a door that should have remained shut." The villagers murmured in horror, realization dawning upon them. The ritual, the eclipse, the omens all had been warnings, but no one had listened. Zahur closed his eyes. "Is there a way to bring it back?" The woman shook her head. "Once something is unmade, it cannot be restored." The weight of her words crushed him. Khem-Aaru was not simply destroyed. It was gone forever, and those who had been left behind, they were lost to the void. The sun had begun to return, casting its light upon a land that no longer recognized it. But the warmth did not comfort the survivors. They remained in stunned silence, their gazes fixed on the empty expanse where their village had stood. Some wept for their loved ones, their cries swallowed by the endless sky. Others stood motionless, unable to comprehend what had happened. Zahur looked around, counting those who remained. Less than 20 had escaped. From an entire village, only a handful had survived. A young woman clutched her child tightly, sobbing. "Where are they? My husband, me parents." "They are not dead," the nomadic woman said softly. "They are elsewhere." Zahur turned to her sharply. "What do you mean?" She met his gaze. "They are trapped in a place without time, a place that does not exist, yet cannot be erased." The silence stretched. The meaning of her words sent chills through Zahur's bones. The people of Khem-Aaru had not perished. They had been forgotten. The nomadic woman lifted her hood, revealing sharp, weathered features. There was something ancient in her eyes, something that had seen this happen before. "This story must not be lost," she said. "If Khem-Aaru is truly forgotten, then it will happen again." Zahur felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. The world had already erased Khem-Aaru from existence. What would stop it from erasing the memory as well? The survivors exchanged uneasy glances. Would anyone believe them? Would their words be dismissed, just as Zahur's warnings had been? The woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "Promise me, Elder. Keep the tale alive." Zahur nodded, his voice firm despite the grief inside him. "I will." The survivors gathered their strength, turning away from the place that no longer held a home for them. They did not know where they would go, only that they had to carry the truth with them. And so, they walked. Behind them, the wind swept across the sand, whispering the name of a village that no longer existed. The survivors of Khem-Aaru traveled for days under the scorching sun. Their feet blistered, their hearts heavy with grief. They moved in silence, their eyes vacant, as they left behind everything they had ever known. Their only hope lay in the grand city of Waset, where the Pharaoh ruled from his golden palace. If anyone could explain what had happened, if anyone had the power to undo it, would be him. When they arrived at the city gates, the guards scoffed at their ragged clothes and weary faces. "You claim an entire village has disappeared?" one guard sneered. "Madness." But Zahur would not be dismissed. He demanded an audience, swearing upon the gods that what he spoke was the truth. At last, the guards relented. Before the Pharaoh's court, Zahur knelt and told the tale of Khem-Aaru's vanishing, the omens, the ritual, the darkness, and the void that had swallowed their home. The nobles whispered among themselves. The high priests exchanged uneasy glances, and though the Pharaoh's face remained unreadable, his vizier, an older man with piercing eyes, leaned forward. "You say there was a ritual?" the vizier asked. Zahur nodded. The vizier glanced at the priests. "Summon the scribes. This tale must be written." But even as they recorded his words, Zahur could see it in their eyes. They did not believe him. The Pharaoh ordered an expedition to investigate Zahur's claims. Soldiers, priests, and scribes rode into the desert, their banners fluttering in the wind as they followed the path to where Khem-Aaru had once stood. When they arrived, they found nothing. No ruins, no broken homes, no sign that a village had ever existed. Only untouched sand stretched before them, endless and silent. The head priest dismounted his horse, running his fingers through the grains of sand. There was no trace of fire, no remnants of stone or clay. It was as if the land had never been disturbed. One of the scribes hesitated. "Could we have come to the wrong place?" Zahur clenched his fists. "This was our home. I know this land." The soldiers looked among themselves, unconvinced. There was no evidence, no proof. That night, when they returned to Waset, the Pharaoh listened to their report. He sighed, then turned to his scribes. "Record this as a tale of the desert," he commanded. A myth to be told, nothing more. And with those words, Khem-Aaru was erased from history. The survivors of Khem-Aaru remained in Waset, but they never truly belonged. They were treated as beggars, as outcasts, as madmen who spoke of things no one could see. Over the years, they found work where they could, some as laborers, others as servants, but the weight of their past never left them. They alone carried the memory of a village the world refused to acknowledge. Strange dreams began to plague them. In their sleep, they saw glimpses of Khem-Aaru, its streets still alive, its people still there calling out, waiting to be found. But when they awoke, there was nothing. A young woman, one of the last survivors, wept in Zahur's arms one night. "I hear them," she whispered. "I hear their voices." Zahur's heart ached. He, too, had heard the voices in his dreams. The dead were not gone. They were simply lost. Years passed. The last of the survivors grew old, their numbers dwindling. Zahur, now frail with age, sat in a quiet corner of a temple, scratching a final message onto a papyrus scroll. He knew that soon he too would be gone, and with him the last true memory of Khem-Aaru. He dipped his reed pen into ink, his hands shaking as he wrote. "We were once a people of the land, blessed by the gods. But the veil between worlds was broken, and the sky turned against us. Khem-Aaru vanished, and with it all who remained." If these words are ever read, let them serve as a warning. Some doors must never be opened. Some names must never be forgotten. He rolled the scroll and sealed it with wax. Then, with great effort, he rose and placed it deep within the temple's archives, where no one would think to look. His task was done. He closed his eyes and whispered one final prayer. And as the wind howled outside, carrying with it the forgotten whispers of Khem-Aaru, Zahur breathed his last. But the story remained, and somewhere, in a place beyond time, the lost villagers still waited to be remembered.